Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad, here with the podcast, Capitalism Hits Home. This is a show about the intersections of capitalism, race, gender, class, and all the aspects of our personal lives. I'm privileged today to have a special guest who will help me to elucidate this topic, Tess Fraad-Wolff.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm a psychotherapist in New York City, specialize in gender issues.
Thank you. This is a show about all these intersecting aspects. We're trying to alleviate the mysteries. We're trying to connect things for you and to get across information that isn't out there regularly. And this podcast is brought to you by Democracy at Work. We hope it serves you well. Today, we're going to talk about Britney Spears. And the reason we're talking about her is her case has captured the American imagination. It's captured America because her plight is an allegorical story about the plight of the mass Americans. And it's a plight that has class aspects, gender aspects, aspects of sexuality and female sexuality and its treatment, as well as male supremacy and capitalist exploitation, all rolled into the case of Britney Spears. Today, by the way, I want to add one more aspect of Britney's life, which captures problems of the American experience, and that is her medication to keep her docile and manageable. First, I want to talk about Britney Spears' plight as an example of male supremacy and of a woman overruled. Britney Spears was in a conservatorship, which was based on Britney's father's assertion that she was senile and addicted. She did have problems with substances. However, by 2021, she was completely sober for over a year, and her, quote, senility did not stop her from memorizing countless lyrics and dance moves which she performed and whose riches were then given to her father. Britney's mother had opposed the conservatorship because she said that Britney's relationship with her father and her father's relationship to her was, in her words, toxic. Even Bessemer Trust, a trust company that Britney's father had hired because he did all the hiring, quit because they didn't want to work under these conditions. And although under California law, conservatees, the people who have a conservatorship, are owed 5 days of consideration before accepting a conservatorship, those 5 days were waived by a corrupt lawyer, an court advocate, Sam Ingham, and a corrupt lawyer named Getz, who waived her rights to any say at all. By the way, that Sam Ingham, who recently quit because the gig is up, was paid $3 million, and he was supposed to advocate for Britney. You can imagine how he advocated. The piper plays the tune. He got as a yearly salary $520,000, about 5 times what Britney was allowed to spend. Britney's father's conservatorship was, once her rights were waived, extended and extended. He's had that conservatorship for 13 years. And he spent about $1 million, actually a little less than $900,000 on lawyers to try to extend his conservatorship. And of course, the money he spent was Britney's. He didn't make any money. He was the head male. He made the rules for Britney. No marriages, no romances, no friends that might have contradicted his complete hold over Britney. And Britney is an example of how gender can be presented by our more reactionary people in the media. Tess, do you want to talk about that? You're an expert on gender.
Yeah, I think it's important to clear out some of the explanations and to add to them. I think that Britney was allowed to have people who only got too close to her. Once people got close to her, it's now being reported. Ronan Farrow recently wrote, and Gia Tolentino, an excellent article in the New Yorker elucidating a lot of this. But people could get close to Britney, but once they got beyond a more superficial closeness, her father came in and threatened them with suing them or alienated them otherwise. This is classic textbook behavior about an abusive relationship, when an abusive partner very often isolates the abused person, isolates them from allies, from friends, from families. In the egregious cases, takes phone away, takes away,
He did take her phone.
Exactly. Takes away the possibility of contacting the larger world and all of the people who may be useful within it. And all of these things happened with Britney Spears. All of these things were like she became a captive, He captured her. It reminded me of, a princess stuck in a tower by an evil father in a fable or some olden tale. Except that she was also made to labor. And it was from her wealth that the tower was able to be constructed.
That's a very good image.
It's disturbing. The whole thing is disturbing. But because it's disturbing, I think it has kindled the public interest. Her fans have always been extraordinarily devoted to her, and they have been invaluable within her, hopefully, ascendant emancipation. However, I wasn't a particular fan of hers.
Me neither.
And have become really interested in the case as a case of terrible predation and her emerging as an empathetic victim.
I think that's true. And I think she's attractive to all of us because what has happened to her has happened to the American public. Her exploitation rings a bell with the exploitation that has happened to the American public. And I'll talk more about that later. But her career started with a particular little girl's sexuality, the sexuality of a little girl who is an object for men without a desiring sexuality of her own. She started to perform and her parents started to rake in the money.
And she was very sexualized.
Very.
Her first hit, The Baby One More Time, was her dressed as a schoolgirl. It felt pedophilic. And once again, she was represented as a tantalizing woman child, too meekly presented to understand her own sexuality, but there to stoke the sexuality of the male gaze, which is appropriative and showing a female as them to be sexual for the other and not themselves, which is a humiliation. It's really an eradication of one's own humanity, is to exist for the gaze of the other.
Totally. And what has happened is as the women have had to pour into the labor force, because men's jobs were exported to China, computerized, robotized, etc., is that women have had to work. And with that work outside the home came an independence. And women are rejecting those roles as just objects for men or as managers of men's households, being full-time servants and doing the cooking, the cleaning, the domestic work, the emotional work for the couple, the social connecting with their men and other people, and bearing children and bringing up children and being sex objects for their men. That has been a revolution. And his marketing, his daughter, is an example of the counter-revolution that's there, with the total attempt to desexualize and disempower women, the fight against abortion rights that give us control over our own bodies, the fight against insurance companies covering birth control pills while they had made no problem with Viagra being covered.
Yes, but it includes the labor market now, which needs women to work, and women are working more and more and have accessed entrance to all these different fields in which they were subtly, if not more overtly, prohibited, excluded, and alienated. Now it's not a story of a woman being merely exploited again, hypersexualized, preyed upon, or sort of pedophilically offered, but a woman who's actually making enormous amounts of money, is very, very successful for many years, and the appropriation of her sexuality has included to be appropriation of the money. That sort of includes all of these things. As women make more money, then the men are hanging on not just to the power over them, but trying to take power over the money they're making because of the new access they have.
And because of the new necessity to work, which is self-fulfilling, and a lot of people wanted to work, but is now necessary because a couple with both working can't make as much as what a man won who got a family wage.
And her father appropriated the work too. She wanted to take time off. He didn't let her. He wanted to keep on making money through her and pushing her and threatening her to keep being this ATM. So even when she was the one making the money, it was still appropriated and controlled by her father, which is such an age-old patriarchal disturbance.
It sure is. And it's what it's like is that it's an attempt to reinforce a feudal household, a household owned by the male who has all the money and the power, where women labor. And that has changed as women have entered the labor force, and also as women have refused the role of playing full-time servant after they've been working all day. And that's why the U.S. divorce rate, since the time that women had to pour into work in the mid-70s and male jobs were outsourced and computerized and robotized, since that time, divorces have gone up 5 times. And the initiators of divorce are overwhelmingly women. And the majority of American women are now single for the first time in our history, because they're rejecting the idea of what Arlie Hochschild in her book calls the second shift, that they get home from work and then have a second shift. And so that there is this revolution going on in the household, a class revolution, from feudalism to either an independent household where women make their own money and decide what to do with it and raise their children by themselves, or a communal household where people share, where both work and both share the domestic work and the child rearing. Those are new family forms. But as the people who invaded the capital, who were overwhelmingly macho men, they want to return to that feudal household while women are also working outside the household, the way they did in Nazi Germany, where women had to work in the munitions factories, where they were paid less because their work was considered less valuable, and they weren't allowed to use birth control because the state wanted more fodder for their cannons, and men were put in ascendancy, but women had to work and their wages were appropriate.
It's always been true with the issue of dowry, where the woman has been historically, and still in some cultures, expected to bring a sum of money with her to a marriage, presumably to a man in the history of legal marriage, and the men would then appropriate the dowry. The woman was not classically considered for the dowry at all. It would be decided upon by the man, who was expected in many traditional, ways and cultures and practices to control it.
That's right. And any wages that women made, even in the 1920s, were legally given to their husbands. And once a woman was married, she couldn't own property or have rights in her own name. Those things have been changed because of the women's liberation and the feminist movements. But that's where we come from. And that's where these forces would like us to go back. I mean, you told me the story of a client who used that, who advertised in Christian Mingle and a dating site for super Christians that said, I want a man, a real man.
Not a client. No, this woman was I think she was written about in social media, but it was excellent. She went on Christian Mingle, advertised looking for a real patriotic, hyper macho man, and was pushing for it. And these men wrote in, and one sent her repetitive pictures and documentation of his participation in the January 6th insurrection, and she turned it in. And she turned him in, and he was arrested.
Right, because she wrote, I want a real man.
Yeah, well, she was challenging, to see. She was already on Christian Mingle. She was already looking for someone who ascribed to, quote, traditional, unquote, values. And she found a description of it that fit the violent insurrectionist.
Exactly. And she asked for pictures, which was very smart.
Yeah.
Because then she could match them up and send them into the FBI. It was very smart. Capitalism plays a huge role here, as well as patriarchy and chauvinism. And the benefits, of course, of making women lesser and paying them less is a capitalist benefit to those who are hiring. And Britney's father used the capitalist system and the patriarchy.
Sure.
He just, as examples, Britney released 4 albums in 4 years, and to promote them, she did a global tour, which netted her $131 million that her father appropriated. She promoted the X Factor and got $50 million in pay. In her Las Vegas residency, she was paid $300 million. So we have 50 million, 131 million, 300 million. And as a last to mention, in another one of these examples of her father appropriating her money, she earned $15 million from Estee Lauder for advertising for Estee Lauder commercials. She was threatened and forced to perform even if she was tired or didn't feel well, while she was restricted to an allowance of $124,000 a year, while her father was appropriating hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yes, as well as other family members were being paid and paid off, it looks increasingly like. Siblings.
Her brother was part of it.
All of these different people were paid and paid off to enslave her, to follow her to the sauna, to watch her when she worked out, to watch her drive to the gym where she worked out, to watch her to go to all of the places.
To make sure she had no cell phone and no way of communicating.
She was monitored and surveilled at all times. She was drugged against her will. I mean, it's a truly horrifying story.
And it's a story that is reflective of the American people. In an Amazon factory, you are watched every minute. Mm-hmm. And
increasingly in this life, I think the surveillance is endless.
And they have appropriated, during the pandemic, they appropriated many, many millions of dollars in addition to the billions that Jeff Bezos had. And with that money, he uses that money, just like Britney's father did, to not only surveil the workers. In one article, the man mentions that he went to the Union Hall, after which 3 Amazon people came and visited him to help him know how to vote. And this was in the Bessemer, Alabama union election.
Yes, I read that article.
And what happened was Bezos then used those billions, and he hired a consultant whose last name was Brown, paid him $3,200 an hour. I'm sorry, a day, whereas the average Amazon worker gets $124 a day. He paid him $3,200, and also Brown had all the money he wanted for whatever expenses. And one of those expenses was little prizes, little medals to give to Amazon workers who said that they would vote against the union.
Yes, that sounds like, the many, and we've only heard about a few, but within the Britney Spears case, the many perks and gifts that were given to buy off various employees and to buy off family members, the entire thing.
to buy off anyone who was interested in helping her liberate herself.
Yeah.
And the same thing that Bezos did
That
and
gifts,
Amazon
perks, cash, all of these were given to keep people shut up, and also keep them assistive in his mission to enslave his daughter and exploit her for every dollar she generated.
That's
and
right.
that was many, many dollars.
And he paid off even the family members, just like Michael Jackson did with the children he abused. He gave big gifts to their parents.
Of
so
course.
They let them go and stay at his Never Never Land estate.
There was an
over
R.
the
Kelly
weekend.
who would go buy sneakers and help with home repairs. There are all these ways in which powerful men have used celebrity, power, and wealth to dazzle and distract family members and coax complicity from allies and family members of victims.
Yeah, because who pays the piper calls the tune, and it doesn't matter where the piper got his money.
I think that this is true about Catholic Church officials who have abused children as well.
That's right. Another example is the paparazzi, who followed her everywhere because they get up to, what did you say, 200,000?
I mean, in the early 2000s was sort of the age of this. It boomed, and paparazzi, especially the hypersexualization of young women, which has always been there, took off, sort of soared to new grotesque heights. And different women, Britney Spears was absolutely prominently among them, but Paris Hilton, Christina Aguilera, somewhere in pop music, like Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, Paris Hilton tried. She was more on the socialite end. But a lot of these young women became paparazzi targets, and magazines sort of boomed in number that were created just to document and talk about this. Celebrity worship and celebrity culture
And photos.
was rising to its height. This was also in the neocon stage, which I think is a very important coincidence.
Yeah, to distract people.
As Bush came in and decided to start this war and decided to kind of usher in a neoconservative movement, so too did this hypersexualization of young girls, some of the purity culture, which is pedophilic culture with a different name, was born.
Yes. And what they were trying to kill as they were born was the nascent power of women in the workforce and in their homes. And of course, this is like what happened to Lady Di that ended up killing her. To escape the paparazzi, she took off in a car and then someone sideswiped her car. There's no proof of who did that. But she was desperate to escape because she had no privacy.
Well, the predation was unspeakable. No privacy at all, and also feeling hunted, feeling disrespected, dehumanized, because these photographers, some of them rather guiltily discussed it in the documentary a handful of months ago, maybe, Framing Britney Spears. It was really good. I think the New York Times was involved. But some of the paparazzi, the photographers, talked sort of sadly and saying, we didn't realize we were doing so much harm. Others have stayed silent, but they do talk about being able to live for a year on one picture, and so no longer caring the damage that they might be doing.
That's
not just intruding on someone's day. Sometimes it's humiliating them. It's, exploiting vulnerability of young people, particularly young women.
However, they're not supposed to look twice, just like Jamie's. Look, Trump was extolled even though he cheated people and raped people. Because if you have the money, nobody asks how you got it.
I think the end is about hierarchy and us choosing to pedestalize money, fame, and power.
Which was really increased in the neocon era of George Bush.
That's when a new kind of lurid display of celebrity worship was also born, and I'm sure it wasn't a coincidence.
No, it's a distraction.
It's a distraction, and it's also the reverence of money, because celebrities have money the vast majority of time. And money, power, wealth, money, power, visibility, really kind of swim around each other.
And people can feel that they're somehow identified with and part of this wealth without looking at the fact that they're being systematically cheated
Also,
out of the wealth they create for other people on the job.
Yes, and they like the second best position. And it's very American and it's very capitalist. It's, if I can't get that, then I'm going to see how close I can press my face to the throne of the person who can get it. Mm-hmm. That's what we have now, are all these billionaire worshipers, which I find so embarrassing. Culture of bootlickers with undiagnosed Stockholm syndrome, loving their torturer because they've become so used to the idea that they can't get the money. They choose a second best of cozying up next to the person who's holding all the money, not realizing that they stole it from them.
Exactly. And one of the ways that they have facilitated this in the United States, in addition to celebrity worship, is by medicating the American people. 1 out of 4 women in the United States takes psych drugs.
Yeah.
6% of children are put on psych drugs. Rather than change the curriculum and make it more vital and exciting.
Yes, and also
they want to drug the kids.
Of mass killers are on psych drugs.
Yes.
And they're everywhere.
But that is a weapon of control, so that you are numbing and dumbing the American people with these psych drugs. And a man named Marinas, who's a disability lawyer, summed it up. He said their strategy is to isolate, which they did isolate Britney, and they kept her from her supports. And Americans are so isolated in front of their own individual TV. They're not encouraged to join unions.
Also, they're stuffed into working so many hours a week that they can't even be close to friends if and when they have them, communities if and when they have them. They can't be close to them in the ways that they want to because they don't simply have the time because they're so overworked. And constantly overworking creates an isolation in and of itself.
It sure does. And you're so wiped out as a person after the isolation. All you can do is sit dumbly in front of a television where products
you may not have the energy to nourish the social relationships on which you depend.
Because it takes
for your mental
time.
Health.
It takes time to have a friend.
And work.
Marinas, a disability lawyer, summed up the strategy, which applies both to Britney Spears and to the American public. The strategy is to isolate, medicate, and liquidate the assets. So you isolate them, you medicate them, and you exploit them on the job and isolate them to the point where they don't realize it. There was a study by Putnam called Bowling Alone, which has been repeated many times, even to last year, where 1 out of 4 Americans has no one to talk to, even in the worst emergency, because people have been so isolated. Now, this is a really important thing because Britney taught us a political lesson, how to get out of our isolation. As long as she was isolated, she could be ruthlessly exploited. But when she went public on June 23rd and talked about her imprisonment, and with little hints on TikTok before that.
Well, her and her fans had been communicating.
They created a mass movement and a mass awareness of her enslavement.
Yeah.
And with that mass awareness, they created such publicity that Britney became informed of her rights. She heard from a different lawyer that she actually has the right to appeal her custodianship. And in spite of their efforts to silence her, she did, and she got out of it. And since she did, those hangers-on are quitting. So, for example, her manager this week.
Like dominoes, they're starting.
Exactly. Her manager quit this week, and so did the advocate, Sam Ingham, who made $3 million off of her father for being her advocate. And he was supposed to be her legal advocate and never even informed her of her rights.
It's an old trick to pay off the person that you pretend is the advocate for those who you're exploiting. This has also happened with the Catholic Church, wherein the people that they hired, which they said, they said that the people they hired were there to assess any inappropriate behavior and to examine allegations of impropriety, predation, and pedophilia, sex abuse. Those people were then found not only to be paid off, but often in possession of child pornography. So the corruption runs into every corner and crevice.
Because they too were an unaccountable hierarchy.
Yeah, of male supremacy.
Of male supremacy. And one of the things that's been wrong in America from the beginning is the Constitution did have some checks and balances that were wonderful. And the idea of checks and balances is great. However, with that Constitution, only 6% of the public could vote because you had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to have property.
Yeah, you had to own property.
Yeah, so that Native Americans didn't get to fully vote in every state until 1965.
Yeah.
So that doesn't look so democratic. Plus, because so many of them were slaveholders, so many 9 signers of the Constitution held slaves, including Washington and Jefferson, there was no check on money. So someone with money could buy the votes of others, which is where we end up with the best democracy money can buy. And where money that Britney earned was used to keep her enslaved.
I mean, it feels like, instead of just locking a woman in a tower and taking ownership and turning her into property and a slave, which is age-old, now we've added the faux feminist spin of actually having her work too and taking that money too. So it combines these different kinds of enslavement.
That's right. Sexual enslavement and
economic.
economic enslavement, which is these are very powerful tools. And Britney was the victim of all of them.
Yeah.
And of the huge backlash that has come since the 70s, when the women's movement really started in 68, and when Gloria Steinem of the CIA poured money into it to make it a gender-only movement, but a powerful movement to change women's rights to work, to change women's salary share. We now get 82% of the male dollar instead of 59 cents, which we got in the early 60s. But, we're still dealing with these same issues and with a huge backlash, particularly in our judicial system.
Yeah.
Where we have someone who, Anita Hill, was not believed when she talked about Clarence Thomas giving her porn and trying to get her to be a sex object.
She was dismissed.
She was dismissed by the group of white men who were in charge of her
course.
hearing. Your point earlier was very important, which is there is no designation as the unfit father.
Oh, no. We don't have the phrase unfit father isn't a phrase. Also, can you think of a woman pimp? Feels like her father pimped her out in some ways. And it feels like we have an occasional madam that's extraordinarily rare that we talk about. And the one madam that's at all famous that comes to my mind is Heidi Fleiss, who went to jail.
Right.
It's just a very different set of expectations. And it's very gendered and it's very misogynistic. And it's all encapsulated in the Britney story, which I find really fascinating as well as tragic.
And so is the rest of America.
There is the happy, hopeful, I don't know if the word happy is as good as hopeful piece that Britney has gained awareness, has gained some sovereignty. More and more people are aware of the grotesque injustice and appears to be, creating a way out of her hell.
And I think that for the mass of Americans who feel for Britney and who've been captivated by her story, the unconscious component is it's all of our story. Yeah. We live in that environment. We are being fleeced.
Yes.
During the pandemic, the billionaires made, so much money.
Yeah.
The salaries of executives went up 1,000%.
Yeah. The big, mostly white men in charge are taking the money while the rest of us are put in smaller and smaller spaces, more and more surveilled, less and less empowered, with less and less on which to live in an increasingly expensive world.
And that money that we earn is being used to stop the unions that would give us power.
Of course. So we identify with enslaved and exploited humans and can create some sort of hope and possibility for revolution out of that.
And her example of once she understands the level of her exploitation, that she goes public. I often think of that with Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, They vote against the Democratic agenda.
I think we have to hold their feet to the fire.
We
the
have
same way Britney is. But I think it all wraps together. And I think it's a fascinating piece to continue to watch as the news keeps pouring in.
And as Britney went to her public, if the Democratic Party really cared and they weren't afraid of people being mobilized, they could send all sorts of people out to Arizona and also to West Virginia, door to door, to tell the people what their senators are voting for and against, to deprive them in their lives. And if they did that, there would be a big change in those people. But they don't, because they're afraid of the mobilization of the people. And that is what will be our salvation here in America.
Yes, I think that's where we can, come into a more positive and progressive light. That we'll take this and we'll look forward as ways to find inspiration from her story.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. You're an enormous addition. And I would like to say, in summary, that on every level that Americans are controlled by super exploitation, by class oppression, by gender, by medication, all of those things are problems that are part of the American scene. And that's why she has really captivated our interest. Thank you so much for helping with us.
Thank you.
Bye. This has been brought to you by Democracy at Work.